You ever get the feeling like politics is just one big frustrating mess?
Oh yeah, all the time.
So like everyone's pointing fingers at everyone else, at the
Yeah,
system,
sure.
at the politicians, even at each other.
Absolutely.
So I figured today we could try to like untangle this knot of political frustration. See if we can make any sense of it.
Sounds good to me.
So one of the big things you hear is this idea that like the system itself is just rigged
Yeah, it's like it's set up to fail.
against everyday people.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of people actually agree with that sentiment.
Really?
Like a whopping 85% of Americans think running for office is just way too expensive.
It's like you need to be a millionaire to even have a chance.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then there's this whole thing about special interests and lobbyists.
Oh yeah, they have way too much influence.
84% of people think that.
It's like they're calling the shots.
It feels like they're the ones in control, not the people we elect.
That's what it boils down to.
So it's not just the system itself, right? It's the people running the show, too. Politicians.
Oh yeah, public trust in government is at a record low.
How low of a top?
Only 16%. And that's been the trend for the past, 2 decades.
Wow.
It's not a good look.
And Congress is even worse, right?
Way worse. Their approval rating is down to 7%, a 40-year low.
Ouch.
72% of Americans have an unfavorable view of Congress.
So why is there this deep distrust in politicians?
Well, a lot of people think it's because they're just in it for themselves.
Like they're not actually trying to help people.
Right. Over 80% of Americans believe that members of Congress are mixing their own financial interests with their work.
So they're not serving the public good. They're serving their own wallets.
Basically. Yeah.
It's sad that so many people feel that way.
And it's reflected in how they view politicians' motivations for running for office in the first place.
Like, why do they think people run for office?
Well, only a tiny fraction, 15%, believe it's because they genuinely want to serve the public.
So what do they think it's about?
Money, power, fame, the usual suspects.
It's like they see it as a path to self-advancement, not a commitment to public service.
Yeah, that's the perception.
Which is a pretty cynical view, but
Yeah.
if that's how so many people feel, there's got to be some truth to it.
Definitely points to a big disconnect between the public and elected officials.
And that disconnect leads to a sense of powerlessness.
For sure.
You always hear people say that politicians are just out of touch.
Yeah, about a third of Americans think that's the biggest problem with elected officials.
So we've got a system that feels rigged politicians who seem more interested in themselves than the people they represent. Where does that leave the public?
That's where things get interesting because you'd think that with all this negativity, people would just give up completely.
Throw in the towel.
Exactly, but that's not entirely the case.
Really?
A majority of Americans, 57%, still believe their vote can actually make a difference.
So there's still some hope there.
There is, but it's a fragile hope.
How so?
Because at the same time, a whopping 85% of Americans also believe that elected officials just don't care what they think.
So they want to participate, but they feel like their voice doesn't matter.
It's a tough spot to be in.
So what's the answer? Do we just surrender to cynicism?
Well, before we do that, let's take a closer look at this sense of disillusionment.
Like, try to understand where it's coming from.
Exactly, because I think figuring out why people feel this way is key to maybe finding a solution.
Okay, so where do we start?
Let's talk about this perception that the two major political parties are more interested in fighting each other than actually, solving problems.
Ah, yes, the good old partisan divide.
That's a big one. 54% of Americans see a huge gap between the two parties.
And they think it's preventing progress.
Right. It's like they're stuck in this endless cycle of bickering.
Scoring points instead of actually governing.
And a good number of people, 37%, want more options.
More political parties.
Yeah, they're looking for alternatives.
But would that actually help?
That's a good question because only 26% of people believe that more parties would make it easier to solve problems.
So even the idea of more choices is kind of complicated.
It is. There's definitely a sense of exhaustion with all the partisan fighting.
Like people are just tired of it.
57% of Americans say it gets way too much attention.
And it's overshadowing the important issues.
Exactly. 78% believe that important issues are being neglected because of all the partisan bickering.
So we've got a system that feels rigged politicians who seem more interested in themselves than in serving the people.
Yeah.
And this constant partisan fighting that's just sucking the air out of the room.
It's a recipe for frustration, that's for sure.
No wonder people are disillusioned.
But before we completely give in to despair, let's shift gears for a second.
Okay, where are we going?
Let's explore some potential solutions to address this sense of powerlessness and apathy.
All years.
Because even though things look bleak, there might be a way out of this mess.
All right, let's do it.
We were talking about how to address this sense of powerlessness and apathy, right?
Yeah, like, is there even anything we can do?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to understanding the role we play as citizens.
So you're saying it's not just about the politicians, it's about us too.
Exactly, we need to be more active, more engaged.
But how? When you're up against this system that feels so rigged.
I know it's easy to feel that way, but let's think about what a democracy actually is.
It's more than just voting every few years.
Absolutely. It's about active participation, engaging with your community, holding your elected officials accountable.
So it's about more than just casting a ballot.
Way more. It's about being informed about the issues, contacting your representatives, attending town hall meetings, organizing with like-minded people.
Hold on, you're making this sound like a full-time job.
I know it does take effort, but I'm not saying everyone needs to become a political activist.
Okay, so what are you saying?
I'm saying we often underestimate the impact we can have, even with small actions.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, let's say you're concerned about something in your local community.
Like what?
Education funding, environmental protection, affordable housing, whatever it is. You could start by going to a city council meeting and speaking up during the public comment period.
What if you're not comfortable speaking in public?
You could write a letter to the editor, start an online petition, connect with other people who share your concerns.
There are other ways to make your voice heard.
Tons of ways. And even small actions can snowball into something bigger.
I see what you mean about having more power than we realize.
Right.
But sometimes it feels like even when people do speak up, nothing changes.
I get that, and I think it goes back to this disconnect between expectations and reality.
You're saying we expect too much from the system?
Maybe. We have these idealized notions of how government should work.
Like it should run like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah, we want our elected officials to be perfect to solve every problem quickly and efficiently.
To be superheroes.
Exactly, but the reality is, governing is messy.
There's always going to be gridlock and compromise.
It's about navigating complex systems and competing interests, making tough decisions that won't please everyone.
So maybe part of the problem is that we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Could be. We need to be more realistic about what government can actually do.
And understand that progress takes time.
It happens incrementally. Not overnight.
And that it's okay to disagree with our elected officials, to hold them accountable without expecting them to be perfect.
Absolutely. Holding them accountable is crucial, actually. It's how we make sure they're representing our interests.
Okay, I'm starting to get this. We need to be more engaged, more realistic in our expectations, and more willing to hold our leaders accountable.
Right.
But a lot of this frustration comes from the fact that the system just doesn't seem to be working for a lot of people.
I agree. And that's where we need to have some tough conversations about the underlying structures that are causing these problems.
Things like campaign finance reform, gerrymandering.
Exactly. These are complex issues, but they're at the heart of why so many people feel like the system is rigged against them.
And if we want to fix it, we need to talk about it.
We need to demand real change.
Okay, so we've talked about citizen engagement, managing expectations, and addressing systemic issues, but there's still this feeling of being overwhelmed.
By it all.
Yeah, you got the 24-hour news cycles, social media. It's a constant barrage of negativity and outrage.
I know it can be exhausting.
It makes you want to just tune out completely.
But that's exactly what they want.
Who's they?
The people in power, they benefit from our apathy.
So what do? How do we stay engaged without getting burned out?
I think it's about being selective in what you consume, taking breaks when you need them, and focusing on the things you can actually control.
Don't get bogged down in the negativity.
Exactly.
But I think there's also a danger in being too optimistic.
Like thinking everything will just magically work itself out.
Right. If we're not realistic about the challenges, we're not going to be prepared to do the work.
He's got a point. It's about finding that balance between hope and realism.
Acknowledging the problems, but believing that things can get better.
Exactly.
So be informed, but not overwhelmed. Engaged, but not burned out. Hopeful, but not naive.
It's a balancing act.
Easier said than done.
It is, but it's a balance worth striving for, because if we lose hope, we've lost everything.
Well said.
We need to hold on to that belief that things can change.
Even when it feels impossible.
Especially when it feels impossible.
It's easy to get swept up in all this negativity about politics, like it's never going to get better.
Yeah, it can be really disheartening.
Makes you want to just give up.
I know, but I think we need to remember that all this frustration, all this anger, it actually means people still care.
They haven't completely tuned out?
Not yet. They're still invested, even if it's coming out as anger or disillusionment.
So we can work with that.
We can channel that energy into something positive. But how? Well, first we got to recognize that we're all in this together.
It's not about us versus them.
Right, it's about working towards a better future together.
Even if we don't agree on everything.
Exactly. We got to be willing to listen to each other to try and understand where the other side is coming from.
Otherwise, we're just going to keep yelling at each other and nothing's going to change.
That's the problem with echo chambers. Everyone's just talking to people who already agree with them.
We need to have those tough conversations even when they're uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's about building bridges instead of walls.
But how do we stay focused on the bigger picture when there's so much noise, so much drama?
That's where our values come in.
You mean like what's really important to us?
Exactly. What kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of world do we want to leave for our kids?
So connect our actions to our values. Make sure we're fighting for the things that really matter.
That's it. Because when you're grounded in your values, you're more likely to stay motivated, to stay focused on the long game.
And it makes it easier to find common ground with people who share those values, even if you disagree on certain policies.
Yeah, you're getting it. It's about realizing that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves, something bigger than politics.
That's a good thought.
Yeah.
But it's still hard to stay hopeful when you look at what's happening in the world.
I hear you. It's tough, but I think hope is a choice.
Like, we have to actively choose to believe that things can get better.
Exactly. Hope isn't passive, it's a call to action. It's a reminder that we have the power to change things.
So we've talked about finding common ground, connecting our actions to our values, and choosing hope even when it's hard. What else? Anything else we should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that throughout history, people have always fought for a better world.
Even when things seemed impossible.
Exactly. They didn't give in to cynicism. They channeled their frustration into action.
And they made a difference.
They did. And we can too.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners today?
Don't give up. Don't let cynicism win. Stay engaged, stay informed, and stay true to your values.
And never forget that you have the power to make a difference.
That's what it all comes down to.
Well said. And speaking of inspiration and channeling frustration, there's actually a great song by Cream.
Oh yeah, I know what you're gonna say.
Politician. It's a bit cynical, but it captures a lot of the feelings we've been talking about today.
And it shows that these feelings aren't new.
Exactly. People have been grappling with these issues for generations.
Makes you wonder if anything has really changed.
So for our listeners who are ready to channel their political frustration into some rock and roll, check out Politician by Cream.
Good choice.
And as you're listening, ask yourself, has anything really changed since that song was written?
That's a good question.
And what can we do to create a political system that actually works for everyone?
Maybe the answers lie not just in politics, but in art and music and the things that help us make sense of the world.
Well said.